Hello, I'm Karen Barber, and I want to welcome you to Personal Prayer Power. I'm so glad you joined us because we all need the wonderful peace and strength that comes from having a powerful prayer life. I have a big dream, and I need your help in revolutionizing personal prayer. And we're going to start right here in my kitchen. It may seem like a strange place to start revolution, but that's the point of personal prayer. It draws its power from private settings. Our kitchens, our offices, and our cars. Any place we can be alone, one-on-one with God. Anywhere we have the privacy to be exactly who we are. No one starts a revolution without setting goals to change things for the better. Here's our goal: to make personal prayer completely interactive, so it's not just talk, but it's a source of real power. In this first session, we're going to start off dealing with the problem of unanswered prayer. In the following sessions, we'll learn new ways to find an answer to every prayer. We'll deal practically with all sorts of things: how prayer shapes our future, how to pray during a crisis, praying for healing, and how to find more time to pray. All revolutions thrive on action. Since this series isn't just about words but about power, the most crucial part is using our action guide to personally try out new ways of praying. Everything will be based on ideas from the Bible and will be simple enough to use every day. That's why it's called an action guide, not a study guide. The power of this series is in our one-on-one interaction with God. Speaking of interacting with God, let me show you my journals. In them, I've written my experiences over the last 25 years. There are 22 spiral notebooks and 6,900 pages. Everything I share is something that really happened to me that taught me about prayer. When I wrote this book, Surprised by Prayer, I collected true stories of answered prayer from ordinary people all over the country. Listening to them, I started wondering why I wasn't seeing more answers in my own life. So I tried an experiment to find 100 answered prayers. By the third day of the experiment, I realized I needed to make drastic changes in the way I prayed. In this series, I'll share the things that worked. They worked so well that the other day I wrote down answer to prayer number 1091. This whole series is about personal prayer, not group prayer. Here's what makes personal prayer so different. In Matthew, Jesus says, "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Jesus doesn't say, stand up, sit down, close your eyes, lift your hands, pray silently, or pray out loud. He leaves all of that up to us. Shutting a door sets personal prayer free. We can be ourselves. We don't have to worry about how we say things. In fact, we don't have to use words at all. We can laugh or cry or dance. We can throw away old methods that don't work and try new things that do. To start a revolution, we look at our old ideas to see what's wrong. If we made a diagram of how prayer works, what would it look like? This is how I've always imagined prayer. I call it the arrow model. We have a person down here praying. This upward arrow is their request. Here's God up here, and this downward arrow is the answering event. There's only one problem with this diagram: the downward arrow, the answering event. It's usually missing. As an example, I prayed for 10 years about my dream of having a novel published. It never happened. Here are my unpublished novels. These rejected manuscripts force us to admit that this arrow diagram doesn't work most of the time. When something's not working, we try to figure out what part's broken. So let's start with our request. When our prayers aren't answered, right away we pray again, hoping the results will change. When my novels weren't published, I prayed the same thing for 10 years, using different words, more religious phrases, and I asked more people to pray. Then one day, instead of getting the answer I wanted, I got a dramatic rejection that changed my life. I'll tell the whole story in a minute. The second part we try to fix is the answering event. When nothing comes our way, we figure we're getting the wait answer. Waiting's good, but unfortunately it's possible to wait forever if we want the wrong thing. I was doing more waiting than writing. I'd mail off a manuscript and then wait for months to hear back. I wasn't exploring the possibility that there was something else God wanted me to do. When we can't fix the arrows, we try to fix this part, the person praying. When prayer isn't answered, we wonder, is it my fault? We know we're not perfect, and we start to think, we don't deserve anything. One day, after a prayer meeting, a woman came over to me and said, you won't get a novel published until you can give God all the glory. She was right. God deserves all the glory. But she was wrong that this was the reason my novel wasn't working out. I felt like she was saying that I wasn't as religious as I should be. I went home depressed because I knew I'd never be worthy of getting a book published. There is one part of this diagram left, God. Sometimes when prayer isn't answered, we start to wonder if God is missing in action. We question, is God powerful? Is he able to act? Does he hear us? Does he care? And finally we wonder if he exists at all. While I was praying about my novels, I was in a group at church that was discussing a book that says because bad things happen to good people, God must not be all-powerful. One woman said, why pray at all if God isn't able to do anything? Letting small doubts into my mind about God's power made me lower my expectations. I gave prayer a low priority on my schedule. But that still didn't solve the problem. This whole prayer model simply doesn't work. Let's take a revolutionary approach to fixing it. Let's throw this picture away. We finally cleared away our old notions to make way for a new one that works much better. Here's our new interactive picture. It's the steering wheel model. We've got our hand down here, driving along the roadway of life. We pray, and here's what happens. God puts his hand on the wheel. Instead of having to wait forever for a downward arrow, we have an interactive process where God partners with us the very moment we pray, and we go places together. We know that prayer is working by the feel of God's hand on the wheel. This isn't passive prayer where we sit around and wait. It's a dynamic process where we constantly change, grow, move forward, and learn. And here's a new definition of prayer. Prayer is the place where things happen between God and me. The Bible tells us that we have 3 distinct inner powers. Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, and soul. Our minds know things logically, our hearts know things emotionally, and our souls know things on a deeper, transrational level. Let's take our steering wheel and show how prayer worked in my life. We'll start when I was desperately praying, God, please have this novel published. I prayed, God put his hand on the wheel, and then something happened. Whoosh! A complete U-turn. I received that big, flat-out rejection. I thought I was heading this way, and suddenly I was going the opposite direction. The day I got the big rejection, my hopes were high because my novel was being presented by a senior editor at a meeting where the publisher decided which books to do. I prayed like crazy, and then the senior editor called me and told me my novel was rejected again. Did God answer my prayer? In our old arrow model, we'd say, definitely not. I didn't get what I asked for. But with the steering wheel model, where prayer is the place where things happen between God and me, something definitely happened. I prayed and I got an answer, a U-turn. Fortunately, in the steering wheel model, getting a no answer isn't the end because God's hand is still on the wheel. And we're off on an entirely new adventure. The night after the rejection, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I was so depressed, I wondered if I should give up on writing and my life dream of having a novel published. I pleaded, please, God, please. The strangest thing happened. An answering thought came into my mind that seemed to be from God. It said, I like your writing. I was stunned. Why would God like writing that was always getting rejected? I never thought such a thing was possible. Suddenly, a revelation came to me about my motivations for wanting a novel published. I wanted a book with my name on it to prove I was somebody. I wanted affirmation. But in the middle of the night, after the most painful rejection I'd ever gotten, that strange thought said, I like your writing. It was astonishing. Did God really like me and my writing? Was it possible that his view of me didn't depend on big accomplishments or whether or not other people thought my writing was good? The next day I thought and prayed hard, and then I wrote an affirmation in my journal. I am a writer because God says so, and he likes what I write. It doesn't matter if I'm not published. I didn't get what I wanted, but prayer certainly was the place where things happened between God and me. Let's go back and highlight the different answers. Number 1, God seemed to speak to me by sending and answering thought. He spoke directly, personally, and it felt completely true. Number 2, I received deeper self-knowledge about why I wanted a book published. Number 3, God showed me that rejection can be overcome by receiving his affirmation of who I am. And number 4, although I was still terribly depressed, I had a glimmer of hope that God could show me how to go forward. Something happened the next week. A friend was telling me about her terrible longing to have children. Then she told me, but I choose to live a full life even if I never have a baby. Suddenly, an idea came to me for a very different sort of book. I realized lots of people have unanswered prayers. Their lives are on hold for all sorts of reasons. Infertility, divorce, illness, unemployment, wayward family members. We all go through the frustration of having dreams that aren't coming true. When I got home, I started gathering ideas from the Bible about how to live a good life while waiting. I entitled the book, Ready, Set, Wait. 5 years after that no answer about my novel, Ready, Set, Wait became my first published book. Several years later, my second book, Surprised by Prayer, was accepted. When it was time for it to be edited, the publishing house hired someone who worked for another company. When they told me the editor's name, I almost dropped the telephone receiver. It was the senior editor from 7 years earlier who'd given me the bad news of that traumatic rejection. An incredible feeling of God's presence came over me. After 7 long years, I finally understood that it had been God's hand on the wheel, turning it in a new direction when my novel was rejected. Those 10 years I was praying to have a novel published, God had something else in mind. He didn't want me writing novels. God wanted me writing nonfiction, true experiences that help people use the Bible in practical ways. It's interesting to ask, exactly when was my prayer answered about having a novel published? In the Arrow prayer model, the answer unfortunately is never, because that manuscript is still gathering dust in my closet. However, with the steering wheel prayer model, we can say that my prayer was answered 6 hours after my rejection when God told me he liked my writing, and then it was answered again the next morning when I accepted his affirmation that I was a good writer. Then it was answered again a week later when I visited my friend who wanted a baby. It kept on being answered for days and months and years as I lived out the principles in Ready, Set, Wait. So, when was my prayer answered? It was constantly being answered as God interacted with me day by day and moment by moment. We may be thinking, that's a nice example, but something good eventually came out of that no answer. What about situations where things don't get better, where things even get worse? Let's take the wheel again as I tell about another desperate prayer when my 82-year-old father had emergency esophagus surgery to save his life. Let's take the wheel and pray, God, please heal Dad and give him a full, rapid recovery. God put his hand on the wheel, and nothing happens. The fact is, Dad lived another 1.5 years. He went through some hard times, and we went through some hard times trying to care for him. Was my prayer answered? In the old arrow model, we would say absolutely not, and we might even say it with regret and bitterness. But in the steering wheel model, all we have to do to see that God is answering is to look at the wheel and ask, what happened between God and me? The answer is that God's hand was on the wheel and God went through that terrible time with us. Through my experiences with Dad, I learned some incredible truths that I'll share in this series. In the steering wheel model, our answers to prayer aren't a single answering event. They're a series of movements, steadying influences, discoveries, and personal breakthroughs. Our situations don't have to change even a tiny bit for the better for prayer to be magnificently answered. In Matthew, Jesus says, "Your Father knows what you need before you ask Him." That's because He's there with us, helping us steer down the road. That's why we can pray a single word like help, or no, or please, and there's no need for explanation. The steering wheel model has a revolutionary effect on how we pray. In the old arrow model, we were passive. Our duty was done after we made our request. In the steering wheel model, interacting is everything. We don't simply present a request. We present ourselves and our wills to God. This week, you'll experiment with interactive prayer by asking, what happened between God and me? Something will come, and whatever it is, you'll be off on an incredible journey into personal prayer power.